Hello everyone, this is Soren Erwich, and today I'll be speaking about three main laws that resulted in the stealing of native land. The laws I'll be speaking about today will be the Johnson and Graham Lessees versus McIntosh, 21 U.S. 543 in 1823, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the 14th Amendment. All of these bills led to the way that indigenous peoples are treated now socially, legally, and geographically. And these laws in the early 1800s really shaped how we think about property, race, and changed the landscape of how Native peoples experienced their lives going forward. To begin, I'll kind of read you the law, the Johnson and Graham Lessee versus McIntosh law, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail about how this actually affects people today. So, the law itself. Quote, land transfers from Native Americans to private individuals are void. When a tract of land has been acquired through conquest and the property of most people who live there arise from the conquest, the people who have already been conquered have a right to live on the land but cannot transfer title to the land, end quote. And then the second part of this bill is, quote, a title to lands under grants to private individuals made by Indian tribes or nations northwest of the River Ohio in 1773 and 1775 cannot be recognized in the courts of the United States, end quote. So what is this bill really saying? It's pretty much talking about how native land is cultivated and owned. So in the past, they knew that Native Americans had been on this land for generations. However, colonizers from France and from Britain still wanted to keep the land, so they needed to make a system in which they had legal responsibility over the land. I think that a big part of this is understanding how laws got used in order to take things or give things away, right? No matter what, those conquerors were really interested in taking the land from the native peoples, and so they were going to do whatever they could to do that. We see this a lot in the early 1800s bills where they use language to fight both sides of the argument pretty much against whatever group they're trying to oppress. So we see this with how they talk about Britain's oppression in the Americas and, oh, we don't want to do that to other people when it talks about other white colonizers. However, they'll still use the same language later on and talk about the brutality of colonization when it benefits them. So, speaking a little bit more about how this cultivated the laws that we have today, these quotes kind of speak about how land and property claims came from either the British or the French, right? So I will give you one of the opinion pieces that was in a part of this document. So, I quote, which they had ceded to France, and she held them under, and among of which the aforesaid posts of the Kaskaskas and the Vincis, and these Indians, after the treaty, became allies of Great Britain, living under her protections as they had before lived under that of France, but were free and independent, owing no allegiance to any foreign power whatever, and holding their lands in absolute property. The territories of the respective tribes being separated from each other and distinguished by certain natural marks and boundaries to the Indians was well known, and each tribe claiming and exercising separate and absolute ownership in and over its own territory, both as the right of sovereignty and jurisdiction of the right to soil. So they're talking about how once lands become traded, that's when the French and the British have power over these lands. It wasn't that the native people owned the land, because that is the argument they need to have in order for them to take the land, right? So instead of making it about owning land, they made it about occupying versus land titles. Those are the two that are made in a dichotomy, and that's how they actually got more ownership over Native American lands. The significance of the word occupied is a little bit more clear in this quote. So, the ceded territory was occupied by numerous and warlike tribes of Indians, but the exclusive right of the United States to extinguish their title and grant the soil has never, we believed, been doubted, end quote. So that quote really just shows the separation between the terms of occupied and right of land. It's clear that the terminology of occupying land does not protect the native peoples from having their land bought and sold and traded, right? So again, This is how the white Christian European settlers and the British settlers kind of took control over all of this division of land. And within that quote, we also see language like numerous and warlike to describe Native peoples. To further separate colonizers from indigenous peoples, a lot of the times in these older bills, demeaning language was used to further minimize indigenous people, allowing for discourse to move towards them being inept of taking care of their land. We see the same kind of language used for Black Americans and people that were enslaved, as the more laws were written and used language calling these people less intelligent, made it more morally okay in their heads for these colonizers to take advantage of these people. And this bill was from 1823. The power of this bill really laid the groundwork for land theft and furthered the oppression of Native peoples for the generations to come. All right, moving on to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was when we got to see how these racialized bills of the past that separated people in terms of racial hierarchy manifested to a big movement. So, I'll quote the bill itself. This act of Congress, passed in 1830, authorized President Andrew Jackson to transfer Eastern Indians tribes to the territories west of the Mississippi River. Although Jackson had described their removal as voluntary, this legislation promised the aid and assistance of the U.S. government. The Indians would be forced to trade land on which their people had lived on for hundreds or thousands of years for land they had never seen. The actual relocation would culminate in the 1838 forced march known as the Trail of Tears. As we can see from this bill, this is how racism cultivated an atmosphere where they could force people out of their land, right? So at this point in time, there was already an understanding that Native American land could be bought and traded by any of the colonizers, however, could not remain in the power of indigenous tribes. Around this time, it's actually, you could do some more research, but the Cherokee tribe actually tried to fight with the government as they told them that they were a sovereign nation, which they were. And Jackson asked them to kind of prove to their government how they were sovereign enough for these new colonizer standards. It didn't matter how much information that they gathered, the Cherokee peoples. While they did bring their whole tribe together, got signatures from almost everyone in their tribe, this was still not enough to convince the government to allow them to keep their land. This was never about being fair or equal. Their removal was not voluntary, right? And so this is actually just another point of colonizers using their systems and their powers in order to move people however they want. It doesn't matter if the Native peoples had played their game to a T, because that's what the Cherokee people did. They still were removed, and that led to the Trail of Tears. So around this time in the early, or now mid-1800s, people were becoming more aware of the racial hierarchy that was coming into play here. Not only were there laws kind of mildly enforcing this, but also the socialization that came along with it really kind of grew how racism grew and became a part of American society like we see it today. Because of that, we finally reached a point in 1868 where the 14th Amendment was passed. So here is the 14th Amendment. Quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws. End quote. While this sounds fantastic, it's protecting the citizens of the United States, it's important to realize who counted as a citizen of the United States. There are so many people within this era that still don't fall under the title of a citizen, right? It takes many, many more years for Native Americans to be realized as citizens and for women to be realized as citizens. While this is a law that later helped once there was more recognition for citizens across the United States, this bill also helped free those who were enslaved. However, there was a lot of work that needed to be done in the future. The other part of this bill that's important to realize is the line that talks about, quote, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law," end quote. And I think it's important to realize that how was law being practiced in this era? How was the literacy rates? Who was getting access to education, right? So if people didn't have the access to education, then they could not fight these laws. I also think it's interesting that they focused on life, liberty, or property. Property in this context here feels a little bit bizarre because it's putting someone's physical life on the same pedestal as a piece of land. Again, this is all because of the way that land is being redistributed in this time due to how enslavers are managing their properties, and then after the Emancipation Proclamation, how that got split up, how immigrants were coming into the country, how Native American land was being traded within tribes as well as towards settlers and colonizers. So having this line about property is really important in this time. The way that all of these laws really talked about property and the rights that people can have shape how we look at people today and how we look at property today.